Hey guys! So, now that we have declared war on Japan and Germany, we're going to have to start what we call the mobilization effort. So mobilization basically just means getting ready for war and getting our country prepped for war. So there are some problems that we've got to kind of take care of as we're getting ready for war here at home that really need to be solved. So we're going to see kind of what those problems were and how the government went about to solve them. So let's just jump right in. So the first thing that we have is the expansion of the military. Obviously, we recognize this is going to be a really big, long, hard war, right? So as it is a big, long, hard war, we're going to need a lot of men to fight it. The leader of kind of the army here is the Chief of Staff, General George Marshall. And so he's kind of the one that's in charge of all of this thing. Now, right after Pearl Harbor, we do actually get 5 million men who immediately sign up to volunteer, which is great, right? But that's still not enough. So you might remember that FDR had actually instituted a draft before Japan had even attacked Pearl Harbor, and that was the selective service system. With the selective service system, they end up drafting about 10 million more men. So this is going to be huge, right? This is kind of the best way to get men. And there's going to be men from all parts of society here. However, they also realize that even with that, that's not going to be enough. So for the first time, they're actually going to allow women to join the military. They've found what's called the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, or the WAAC, or the WAC. And these are women who are going to be serving in non-combat military roles. Aides, nurses, secretaries, that kind of thing. So this is a huge deal. Thousands of women all over the country are really eager to serve their country, and so they sign up. Eventually, they dropped the auxiliary. They hadn't gotten the same kind of benefits before because they were kind of seen as secondary. But as the war progresses, they drop the secondary role and they become full military. This isn't just the Army, the Marines, the Navy. There's a lot of different branches who do this as well. But this is going to be the first time that women are allowed to join the military in our country. There are also some significant contributions made by minorities throughout the military. The first, for Japanese Americans, a lot of them serve as translators. Remember, we're fighting predominantly in the Pacific with Japan, so we need some people who speak Japanese. There are stories of like Japanese soldiers who would get like right at the front lines to hear what was going on so they could report back. Incredibly dangerous, right? We also had a huge number of African Americans who joined the Army. Now, it is segregated. The military has not been desegregated yet. So all African American units are going to be all black, but they do make some significant contributions. Probably the most famous are the Tuskegee Airmen. This is an aviation unit, an air unit, and they take out a lot of major targets and become really important. The last really significant contribution we have are from Native Americans. And in fact, huge numbers of Native Americans enlisted in the Army. One general said that if all Americans would enlist the way Native Americans did, we wouldn't have a need for the draft. But there's one way that they served that was really unusual. So these are the Navajo wind talkers, okay? So the Navajo approached the military and said, we've got an idea. See, here's the thing. Navajo language was almost extinct at this point. Very few people spoke it. And it is an intensely difficult language to learn and to understand. So the Navajo said, why don't we be your coders? We can get on, one Navajo at one end, one Navajo at the other. We can speak to each other in our normal language, and they'll never be able to break it. And they couldn't. The Navajo were hugely instrumental in relaying military secrets. A lot of them actually went on to become kind of high-ranking officials. They sometimes would even layer it where they would actually code the Navajo language. So even if the Germans did try to break it, it was also in code. So that was a huge contribution of the military and very important. So this is just a picture of a draft registration card, just so you can kind of see what that looks like. This particular draft registration card is incredibly important to me because that Regan Judson Jones up there was my grandfather. So you can see that he registered at the age of 24 in Robeson County, North Carolina. You can see where he worked. And See, what's interesting about my grandfather is he actually couldn't go because he had been in a car accident where his leg was crushed. So he wasn't able to serve. However, this is my dad's father. My mom's grandfather was able to serve. They were actually the same age. My great-grandfather lived in Georgia at the time, and he was drafted towards the end of the war. They allowed him to stay longer because he had a wife and children, young children. But he was drafted in 1945. He was actually drafted after VE Day, and they were training him to go and invade mainland Japan. Fortunately, the war ended before he could go, and he ended up going into Germany and serving with the occupation of Germany there. But this just kind of goes to show you some of those personal stories that are involved in this. The next issue that we have is forming a reliable workforce, but also work production. So as we are building up our army, we need a lot of stuff. Right? Wars take a lot of stuff. So right after we declare war, FDR actually orders that all factories be closed and converted to war production. So for example, the Ford factory is shut down and then reopens to build airplanes and tanks, right? So factories all over the country shut down. Cars were not made in this country from 1941 to 1945. And all factories were turned into war production factories. This was actually nicknamed the production miracle. If you look down here at these charts, you can see like how much production spiked in our country and how high the spending was on war production at the time. And one of the key things we needed to do was rebuild our Navy as quickly as possible. So the thing about these big battleships, right, is they take a long time to build. But our Navy had been wiped out in Pearl Harbor. We didn't have time to wait around to rebuild our Navy. So there's a guy who comes up with this idea where he uses pre-made factory parts, and it basically is like an erector set ship, and you can put it together really quickly. These get the nickname Liberty ships, and you could build one of them in about 4 days versus the weeks it took to build them the old way. This is huge, and it allows us to rebuild our Navy very quickly, which becomes really important because we're fighting in the ocean, in the Pacific, right? So just a couple pictures here. This is from a factory. You can see they're, excuse me, making airplanes here. These are pictures of some of those Liberty ships. You can see just a huge number of them made really quickly right here in the dry dock. The next thing that we have to deal with is our workforce itself, building this reliable workforce. A lot of men, more than 15 million men have gone over to fight overseas. Who's going to work in the factories, right? They were actually a big fear that we wouldn't have enough people to work in these factories. So one of the things that happened is women stepped up their game, right? By 1944, there were 18 million people in the workforce. Of those 18 million, 6 million of them were women. That may not seem like, you know, it's not even half, but when you compare it to women in the workforce before, you know, even during the Great Depression, women wouldn't go work. But now we've got women not just working, but doing hardcore jobs that men didn't think women could do, like building airplanes. That is the Rosies of the day, right? My grandmother was a Rosie. She was a riveter in an airplane factory in Georgia. My great-grandmother, rather. So this is huge. The other workforce that we turn to are minorities. And a lot of African Americans are trying to get jobs. However, discrimination is still really rampant, and a lot of owners of factories will not hire African Americans except for jobs like janitors. This is really a slap in the face because these people want to help, right? So a guy named A. Philip Randolph decides he's going to protest this discrimination in the workforce with a march on Washington. FDR calls him up and he's like, dude, you can't do this. It's going to cause chaos. Like, this is not cool. We're at war. We can't deal with this. And A. Philip Randolph's like, nah, man, like, we're going to fight for our right in the workforce. FDR is so overwhelmed by this that he responds with Executive Order 8802. So an executive order is kind of like a law, except that it doesn't have to go through Congress. The president can just pass it. And he says, no discrimination in the workforce by race. This is huge. Now, unfortunately, it only lasts for the duration of the war. but it is the precursor of the Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s. So it's a really big deal. Just some pictures here so you can see this is a group of women working in a shipyard. That man on the end is their overseer, but the rest of them are women. Here is an African American woman who is working building an airplane. She is a real life Rosie there. So just to see the men and women of all races who came out to help out. This is just another picture of some women working in engineering, a field that women wouldn't have been able to work in before the war. This is a pretty big deal. The last thing that we have to do is, now that we've got a workforce, we've got to keep making sure that they are reliable. So FDR establishes the National War Labor Board. A couple things that they do is they need to make sure that we keep prices stable, okay? So in order to keep prices from going up too high, he limits wage increases. So this saying that we can't raise our salary, right? That may not seem very FDR-ish, but again, the idea here is we need to keep prices stable. And in any way we can do that, okay, if it means limiting increases in wages. He does actually, though, allow for you to negotiate benefits like paid vacation, pensions, medical insurance. So it's not that workers are being oppressed, right? However, they did forbid you changing your labor union. So if you were a member of a union, you couldn't just up and join another one. We want to keep unions as stable as possible as well because we don't want chaos in the labor unions. So this does limit kind of your options in terms of being in a labor union. The next thing that is passed in 1943 is the Smith-Connolly Anti-Strike Act. So this limits the right to strike in industries crucial to the war effort, right? And if plants do strike, the president has the power to step in and take over those factories. Now think about this. Why would we want to limit the right to strike, especially in these industries? Well, we don't want to stop production, right? If you're striking, you're stopping production. So even though FDR is pro-labor union, he doesn't want to see production decrease, right? We're trying to increase production as much as possible. So that's why we are forbidding striking. The last thing that he does is the War Production Board, or the WPB, and this rations those things that are needed for war production, things like fuel, rubber, steel, plastics, that kind of thing. They would actually have drives where all kinds of scrap metal would be collected in neighborhoods. They would encourage people to donate bicycles or cars. They could recycle a lot of their usage to not buy things like nylon, like women would stop wearing nylon tights. But in order to make it look like they were, they'd draw a line up the back of their leg to make it look like the seam of the tights. And this idea was to make sure that we had the means of production. So not just, the factories working, but we need, the materials in the factories. So rationing makes sure that we can have that, right? The next problem that we have is the government needs to raise money and balance the economy. We're still on the edge of the Great Depression, right? Our economy has been pretty sucky for the last 10 years. We've got to make sure that there's enough money out there. So the first thing they do is issue war bonds. A war bond is basically a loan you give to the government, right? So you say, I'm going to buy this $18 war bond, and on face value it might say $20 on it, and I know that I've loaned that money to the government, and in 10 years I can cash it in and get interest on my war bond, right? So they'll give me my money back with interest. But the longer I keep it, the longer I get the money. This is a way that the government can use to basically borrow money from its citizens, right? So war bonds were really popular, and they had a lot of propaganda to encourage you to buy war bonds, basically trying to say, you're helping the good fight. Even if you can't go and fight yourself, this is a way you can help the military. So that's a big way to raise money. The second thing they do is raise income tax in the Revenue Act of 1942. They actually put income taxes on people that had never paid income taxes before. So all classes of society are now paying income tax, and they increase the tax. The last thing they do is establish the Office of Price Administration, or the OPA. And so this rose wages, prices, and rents. Again, trying to keep prices from increasing, right? That's the idea from the Office of Price Administration. It's a major, major government regulation. Huge, big business, big government, right? The other thing the OPA did was ration food, okay? So there's a couple reasons for this. Food costs money, right? So that's a way to keep prices low. But it's also, they could send food overseas, right? So they would encourage you to plant your own gardens, partly because all the farmers were overseas, right? So you would plant your own gardens. You would, you wouldn't be able to buy sugar, but just like on certain days of the month. Meat, coffee, all of these kinds of foods. And again, it's a way to control prices. So this was a big deal throughout the country, rationing. This is a line of people who are waiting in line to buy sugar, because sugar is rationed. This is a young boy, so they started him young, right? You get a ration book, and basically inside this ration book are these stamps, right? So they look kind of like this. And so when you are going to buy whatever is being rationed, you give over one of your stamps, and you'll be able to buy, fuel or whatever it is that you're buying, meat, sugar, that sort of thing. And it's a way to kind of control the industry and make sure there's enough for everyone. This is just some of the different items that were being rationed: tires, cars, gasoline, stoves for the metal, sugar, coffee, canned foods, typewriters, footwear, like rubber shoes. So that's rationing, okay? And this is something that was going all over the country. People were doing without so they could fight the war. We think about it today like we've been at war pretty much since you guys were kids, but most of you don't think about it every day, right? But the war was affecting people on the home front every day. Like they were dealing with it, when not being able to have a birthday cake because you couldn't buy sugar, not eating meat throughout the week because you were rationing meat, right? So this is a really big deal. The last thing that we have is national security. So keeping the country safe from enemies abroad or perceived threats at home. So there's a couple ways that they do this. The first thing they do is by mobilizing scientists. So they begin development of a project known as the Manhattan Project. And this was a secret development. People did not know about it all throughout the country. This is the development of atomic weaponry, so the atomic bomb. They had a lot of major scientists who were researching this, namely Albert Einstein and Robert Oppenheimer are two of the biggies. And this is going to lead to the development of the A-bomb, the atomic bomb, which, as you know, will eventually be dropped on Japan in order to end the war. The other thing that we did was something called Japanese internment. So this was issued by Executive Order 1066. And essentially what this did was it took all of the Japanese Americans or Japanese immigrants that were living on the West Coast and forcibly moved them into these camps in the Midwest. The idea here is that we're worried that there might be spies amongst Japanese Americans. So FDR issues this executive order that forces the movement of thousands of Japanese Americans into these camps where they're basically being forced to live. Their homes were often sold out from under them. They couldn't take all their possessions with them. It was challenged, but its constitutionality was upheld in the case Korematsu versus the U.S., basically saying that in a time of war, you can limit personal rights and liberties. This is a really big infringement on rights and liberties, right? So just some photographs here. This was an instruction that went up in buildings all over the country. It's the instruction to all persons of Japanese ancestry living in the following areas. So this particular one's from San Diego County. It says, the following instructions must be observed. A responsible member of each family, preferably the head or the person in whose name most of the property is held, and each individual living alone will report to the civil control station, and they must be evacuated. Evacuees must carry with them for departure the following property: bedding and linens, but no mattress for each member of the family, toilet articles, extra clothing, knives, forks, spoons, plates, bowls, and cups, personal effects for each member of the family. The size and number of packages is limited to that which can be carried by the individual or family group, right? So whatever you can carry, you can bring with you. They're putting camps like this all over the country. You can see where these camps are. There was some exclusion in some areas around the country. This is some Japanese, arriving at the camp. You can see all the baggage is kind of being thrown up here. This is a picture inside the mess tent where you can see, this is where they're eating, where they're living. A lot of times they were in like worn down stables, barracks, tents. Like I said, a huge infringement of rights. So you got to kind of wonder why FDR would be willing to do this. You know, what was it? You know, was it discrimination against Japanese? Was it really like a perceived threat against Japanese spies? There would go on to become restitution for these families, but this was really hard for a lot of people. These are American citizens, a lot of them. Even if their parents were immigrants, there were children who, you know, were born in America, gone to American schools, and they're being told they're enemies. A lot of Japanese Americans had joined the army, and their families were put into not concentration camps, internment camps. They're not work camps like what Hitler was doing. It's nothing like that. But they're still being forced to go somewhere that's not their home. So this kind of wraps up the mobilization of World War II, kind of seeing how the home front began to change. Next, we're going to be seeing kind of the ways that battles were fought and where the war was fought. So I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.